12 people sit around a polished mahogany table in a marble building on Constitution Avenue, 8 times a year. None of them were elected. Most of them you couldn't name. They serve 14-year terms, specifically designed to outlast any president who might try to remove them. In the next 90 minutes, they will decide what your mortgage costs, whether your business can borrow, what the dollar in your pocket will be worth a year from now, whether the country goes into a recession. Then they go to lunch. The man at the head of that table is named Jerome Powell. By every account, he is a careful and decent person. He goes to church. He plays guitar. There is no scandal, no corruption, no personal villainy in his story. That is the problem. Because the most dangerous form of power, the kind George Washington spent the last years of his life warning us about, has never looked like a villain. It has always looked like Jerome Powell. On May 15, 2026, he handed the chair to someone else, and the institution continued exactly as designed. This is how Jerome Powell became the most powerful, unelected man in American history, and how George Washington saw him coming. To understand what Washington was actually warning us about, you have to read the part of the farewell address that almost nobody quotes. For 2 centuries, history teachers have reduced his letter to a single phrase about avoiding foreign alliances. That is not the warning that kept him up at night. The warning that kept him up at night was about a kind of power that doesn't answer to elections, a power that survives across generations, a power that watches presidents come and go, while quietly setting the rules everyone else has to live by. In the address, Washington wrote about what he called the insidious wiles of foreign influence. He said the jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake against it, because foreign influence is, in his words, one of the most baneful foes of Republican government. Read the full passage and you realize Washington isn't only talking about other countries. He's talking about any power that operates outside the consent of the governed. Any institution that can shape American life without standing for an election. Any structure where decisions get made by people the public cannot reach. He had a specific example in mind, the Bank of England. Washington's generation didn't just fight a war over tea, they fought a war over money. The colonies had been forced for decades to accept monetary conditions set by an authority 3,000 miles away, an authority no American could vote for, recall, or speak to. The Stamp Act, the Currency Act, the credit squeezes that strangled colonial merchants. All of it flowed from a financial system the colonists had no representation in. When the founders said taxation without representation, they didn't only mean taxes. They meant the entire apparatus of monetary control, the price of credit, the value of currency, the conditions under which a person could build a life. Washington warned that any concentrated power surviving across generations becomes a threat to the republic, because the people who created it are gone, but the power remains, growing, hardening, accumulating institutional muscle. But this was just the warm-up. Here is the part that should make every American uncomfortable. When the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, it functions as a tax. It pulls money out of the economy. It increases the cost of every mortgage, every car loan, every credit card balance, every small business line of credit. When the Fed lowers rates and prints money, it functions as a transfer. The first people to touch the new money, the banks and the asset holders, get the full purchasing power. By the time it reaches a wage earner, inflation has eaten most of it. Economists have a polite name for this. They call it the Cantillon effect. In plain English, it means the people closest to the money printer get rich, and the people furthest from it get poorer. And nobody voted for any of it. We make our decisions independently, based on our analysis of the data and the outlook. That word, independently. Markets love it. Wall Street celebrates it. Every financial publication treats Fed independence as a sacred principle that must be defended at all costs. By the standards of modern monetary policy, it is a genuinely useful principle. If the Fed had to win elections, it would print money every November and the dollar would collapse inside a decade. But independence is also the precise word for the thing Washington spent his entire life warning the country about. The Bank of England was independent too. Independent of the colonies it set monetary policy for. Independent of the merchants it could ruin with a single decision. Independent of any voter in Boston or Philadelphia who lived under its rules. The colonists didn't object to England's monetary policy because it was bad. They objected to it because they had no voice in it. Now ask yourself a question. When Jerome Powell raised interest rates 11 times between March 2022 and July 2023, taking them from near zero to a peak of 5.5%, who voted on that? Who in Congress cast a vote? Who in the White House signed a bill? Which American citizen pulled a lever in a voting booth? The answer is nobody. The decision that crushed the housing market, killed thousands of small businesses, and triggered the regional banking failures of 2023 was made by 12 people in a room. And the man at the head of the table was the one whose face appeared in every news cycle for almost a decade. That is not a flaw in the system. That is the system. But the strangest part of this story is not the power itself. It is how the power was built, and what the men who built it knew about you. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913, more than a century after Washington died. He never knew it would exist. The men who built it, Senator Nelson Aldrich, banker Paul Warburg, Morgan partner Henry Davison, and National City Bank president Frank Vanderlip, deliberately designed it to look nothing like a bank. Because the American public in 1913 hated central banks. 2 previous attempts had been killed by populist outrage, the First Bank of the United States and the Second Bank of the United States. Andrew Jackson had built half his political career on destroying the second one. So the architects met in secret. In November 1910, 6 men, Senator Aldrich, Assistant Treasury Secretary A. Piatt Andrew, Morgan partner Henry Davison, Aldrich's private secretary Arthur Shelton, National City Bank president Frank Vanderlip, and Kuhn Loeb partner Paul Warburg, traveled under assumed names to a private hunting club on Jekyll Island, Georgia, to draft what would become the Federal Reserve Act. The cover story was a duck hunting trip. One man brought a borrowed shotgun to make the ruse believable. They spent 9 days inside the clubhouse. They never picked up the gun. The participants would deny the meeting ever happened for the next 20 years. The bill they produced was a masterpiece of political camouflage. It used the word reserve instead of bank. It scattered authority across 12 regional districts to disguise the centralization. It gave the president the power to appoint the chair, which made it look democratic. But it gave the chair a 4-year term that didn't align with the president's term, which meant no incoming administration could fully reshape it. And here is what those men created. A position that has, today, more direct economic influence than any office George Washington could have imagined. The Fed chair can move trillions of dollars with a single sentence. He can crash the global stock market by hesitating on a word. He can decide, alone, in a meeting nobody else attends, whether the economy is going to expand or contract. When Jerome Powell spoke at his quarterly press conference, more wealth was created or destroyed in the next 90 minutes than is moved by most pieces of congressional legislation in a year. And he was confirmed by 2 Senate votes 4 years apart, with no constituents to answer to between them, no re-election to face, and no mechanism by which an angry voter could ever reach him. Washington warned that the most dangerous form of power is the kind that hides inside an institution everyone has already accepted. By the time you notice it, it is too late to remove it, because removing it would crash the very thing it now controls. That is the Fed. We cannot abolish it without destroying ourselves. And the men who designed it knew that's exactly how it would work. Therefore, when Powell took the chair in 2018, he wasn't taking a job. He was inheriting a structure that had quietly outgrown the only mandate it was ever given. The Fed was created in 1913 to do one job: stop bank panics. The country had just suffered the panic of 1907. J.P. Morgan, an actual private banker, had personally bailed out the financial system from his Madison Avenue library, summoning the heads of every major New York bank to his study and refusing to let them leave until they coughed up enough capital to stop the runs. The political class decided this was unacceptable. The country needed a permanent lender of last resort, an institution that could create emergency liquidity when banks failed. That was the mandate. One job: stop the runs. Today, the Federal Reserve has multiple mandates, statutory and unofficial. It targets inflation. It targets employment. It regulates the banking sector. It manages the dollar's role as the world reserve currency. It bails out hedge funds. It buys mortgage-backed securities. It runs an emergency lending facility for foreign central banks. It has, on multiple occasions since 2008, intervened directly in markets where it has no clear statutory authority to operate. And Congress has retroactively shrugged. After the 2008 crisis, the Fed expanded its balance sheet from under $1 trillion to over $4.5 trillion. After COVID, it expanded again, peaking at $8.9 trillion in March 2022. To put that in human terms, the Federal Reserve currently owns roughly twice as much United States debt as China and Japan combined. That is not stopping bank panics. That is something else entirely. That is an institution that has, slowly and quietly, become the actual operator of the American economy. The buyer of last resort for almost every asset class. The silent partner in every market. And the people who designed it in 1913 are dead. The mandate they wrote is buried under 100 years of mission creep. The institution remains. The consent of the governed, the original constitutional logic that made it tolerable, has eroded with every expansion. Washington warned the public to resist with care the spirit of innovation upon its principles, however specious the pretexts. He wasn't talking about technological innovation. He was talking about institutional innovation. The slow, deliberate expansion of an institution beyond what the public ever agreed to. The drift, the accumulation, the way a thing built for one purpose becomes something else, and then defends its new shape with every resource it has. That is the Fed story. That is Powell's inheritance. And on May 15th, 2026, when Powell handed the keys to Kevin Warsh, the institution was larger, more entrenched, and more consequential than the day he took the chair. And finally, we have to talk about the people who don't appear in any of this. In every Fed press conference, Powell talked about the labor market. He talked about household balance sheets. He talked about the consumer. But the consumer doesn't have a seat at the FOMC. The mortgage holder in Cleveland, whose monthly payment doubled, doesn't get a vote. The small business owner in Phoenix, whose loan got pulled, doesn't get a vote. The renter in Atlanta, whose landlord is passing through the cost of higher capital, doesn't get a vote. These are the people the entire system runs on. Without them, there is no economy to manage. Without their debts, there is no balance sheet to inflate. Without their labor, there is no productive base to back the dollar. They are the foundation, and they are, by design, the only people in the system with no representation in the room where decisions get made about their lives. Washington's worst fear was not foreign influence. Read the address again. His worst fear was a free people forgetting that they are free, accepting, slowly and without protest, a kind of authority that previous generations would have rebelled against in a single afternoon. Jerome Powell is not a bad man. By every account, he is a careful, decent, professional public servant who took a difficult job and tried to do it well. That is not the point. Washington wasn't worried about whether the central banker would be nice. He was worried about whether the banker would exist at all. He was worried about whether Americans would accept, generation after generation, a structure of power that the founders bled to escape from. And we did. We accepted it quietly, without a vote, and without a debate. And one morning, we just woke up to find the most consequential economic decisions in our lives were being made by 12 people in a room we are not allowed to enter. It is late summer, 1796. George Washington sits in the upstairs study of his Mount Vernon estate, finishing the letter. He puts down his quill. He looks out at a country he believed he had built carefully, with checks on every form of power, with elected officials answerable to the people, with no permanent class of unelected rulers above the public. He was wrong about that. On May 15, 2026, Jerome Powell walked out of his last press conference as chair of the Federal Reserve. Markets reacted to every word. Cable news treated his exit as a major historical moment. His successor was sworn in within days, and the institution continued unchanged because it was designed to be unchangeable. Washington warned that the only thing that could destroy the American experiment was the American public's willingness to accept a power they could not vote on. He thought the threat would come from a foreign king, It came from a building on Constitution Avenue, designed by men who knew exactly what they were doing and accepted by a public that had simply stopped paying attention. The candle burned out a long time ago. The terminal is still glowing, and the chair Washington warned us about has a new occupant.